So these sort of big questions. Back in 1987, I had initially published this book chapter called Arts Impact Studies, A Fashionable Excess, where a number of fundamental points were made about what I thought were the rather poor choice of strategies that advocates in the arts were adopting and using traditional spending impact study methodology to advocate for additional government funding or even private sector funding for that matter. And I was concerned that while there could in fact be such economic impacts on either employment or output or government taxation or personal income, that it was unlikely that if these things were done correctly that we would see such results. And that also some of the more fundamental ideas in economics about market failure and when actually you would rationally intervene to correct such failure for being sort of missed. So one of my observations was that the marginal value of one additional study was zero, and we shouldn't do any more of it. So Andre mentioned, he basically said, what's the current state of the situation? I rephrased this to, what is the current role of economic impact methodologies, I call EIM, and is the marginal value of one more study really zero? And so I will get to that very quickly. If EIM was adopted to inject some economic reasoning and measurement into the abstract debate about the value of the arts, was it really instead a parody of economic analysis, which is what I called it at that time? Is that essentially most people within the arts, and this is also true by the way of sports, I have quite a bit to say about economic impact studies in sports as well today, because the issues are extremely similar. And some of you may know, actually I'm a member of the Association for Sports Economists as well in the U.S., which is a very lively group. And in fact, as I'll point out, I think they've certainly outdone me in terms of their utter cynicism about these studies. I mean, there's no greater critics of this methodology than they are at the moment. In fact, I've ended up doing battle with them to suggest that there are in fact positive impacts, both on the traditional spending side as well as the other methodologies that we'll discuss. But there's a remarkable sort of consensus among sports economists that it's almost impossible to ever find, especially the methodology that they're primarily using, which is sort of ex post studies, which are largely econometrics based, to try to find any tracks in the sand, so to speak, after events have occurred, or even in terms of organizations like sports teams, if there are strikes, and so there's no activity going on for a while. Has anybody ever noticed them? And instead of doing what are largely ex-ante prediction studies, which is really what economic impact methodology has traditionally been, they do these ex-post studies, and they have developed by and large a consensus that the impacts, if they're positive at all, and they sometimes are not, and they're just negative sometimes, that at best you could take any of the ex-ante results and divide them by 10 or something and get the actual. So a lot of the action going on methodologically has been with the sports side. So as well, I had mentioned in that earlier paper, and I've done a bit of work since then on these issues, I basically suggested that whether it's the arts advocates or sports advocates, since it's often very difficult to try to measure some kind of intrinsic value of these organizations or facilities or events, it looked like if you tried to measure something tangible, like employment effects and output effects or whatever, that would essentially inject hardcore economics, hardcore measurement into the discussion. But because I think many of the concepts were misused and abused, I sort of called it a parody of economic analysis. The question is that really still the case? Now, as many of you will be perfectly aware, some more than others, but I think all of you know this, while there was this incredible, I think there's been just thousands of economic impacts that have been done, this has also become the case with contingent valuation studies. I mean, this is sort of like in fact, they got so bad for a while in the Journal of Cultural Economics that the editors had to decide how to handle this influx of papers. They finally sort of made a special issue out of it just to get rid of the backlog. So this sort of became sort of what is the pace that contingent valuation, or Jen Snowball's here, and she's written very fluently, and I think in a very intelligent way about isn't the ongoing criticism of economic impact studies without offering concrete solutions or alternatives really just grumpy bitching? Which probably the short answer is yes. There's an element of that certainly goes on. A short overview of some of these answers before I give the substance of it is, if the marginal valuation of another economic impact study was 0 in 1987 when I first wrote this, imagine how negative it must be now after 1,000 additional studies. So if it was 0 then, we're really in trouble now. Of course, even if the social marginal value is low, in some concrete sense, are we learning something out of this? Are we developing more methodologies that can be extended elsewhere as academicians, as scholars, even if we're not really enlightening public policy? There's no question that the private marginal value is perceived as being very high. In other words, the demand for such studies never seems to abate. You'll always have people wanting to do these studies, and it's somewhat understandable why, because even if you can convince people that the full benefits of arts events or organizations or facilities, and by the way, there's a big difference really among those three. I shouldn't always use those in a combined way. Events are quite different than organizations. The economic impact of, for example, an annual operation of a symphony orchestra will probably be much lower, frankly, than some kind of mega event in the usual way that we look at the methodologies. And a new facility, Atlanta has had a debate now for some years about getting a new symphony hall for the orchestra, and moving from one facility to another, except for the construction phase, would probably have very little impact. But anyway, so those three need not be identical. But there's no question that there's an ongoing perception that these are still valuable to do as an advocacy tool. And so, as I point out here, since we're going to always have to do these, since at the next global extinction event only roaches and EIM will survive, and probably also evaluation methods, is imperative to do such studies well. That will also, of course, increase the social marginal value above 0 again if we can actually make some headway on avoiding some of the most fundamental errors. So, in some sense, we can't seem to get rid of these studies, and I no longer believe we should, actually. I never was really opposed to them. I was just convinced that they were being misused, and frankly, that they weren't the strongest card to play among arts advocates. That they were sort of, if in essence, my argument was essentially, if you stress the role of the arts in simply respending and recycling money in local communities, something which would have been equally typical of somebody constructing a bubble factory or having somebody produce something utterly trivial, then you're not stressing what was intrinsically unique about the arts. And so that was likely to not be your strongest card. And I make an observation then, I make it now. I always found this very fascinating that while there have been economic impact studies done at universities, including some of this ancillary spending story of, what the students spend in local communities, and is it really true that employment rises when the university is growing? Those kind of things. There's no doubt that at the university level, those fundamental contributions we usually think of as the additional earnings potential linked to additional skills and knowledge. And in fact, I've never seen one of these economic spending impact studies done for elementary school. This is never done. I mean, nobody sits around saying the value of elementary school is because 8-year-olds spend their meager allowances at the corner convenience store. And that generates additional jobs and employment and income. I mean, this seems to be irrelevant to the whole enterprise of generating fundamental mathematical and verbal literacy and everything else. So clearly there's something going on that's been going on for a long time about instrumentalist arguments versus intrinsic arguments. But anyway, we can't get rid of these studies. We probably should get rid of these studies. Let's just do a better job of getting them right. And indeed, progress has been made in making EIM much less of a parody, and many studies have come reasonably close to generating what I consider the best that can be expected of this ex-ante projection approach. And I'll discuss a few of the improvements that have been made. Now, the major challenges, in my view, continue to be these. There are some specific ongoing technical issues within the application of EIM studies. I'll go over at least a sample of those. Then there's the question of the export-based theory itself. Many of you will certainly be aware that one of the unique aspects of this notion of trying to figure out whether an event, well, even for this whole year in Mariboru being a cultural capital, what are going to be the consequences for the economy of Slovenia or the city of Mariboru? What would be the ex-post results we might see a year afterwards, looking back? What would be the projections of a well-done ex-ante study? In many respects, it always focuses on the notion, which is a long history in economics, but a very tortured one, of whether or not, in fact, these good economic results are primarily because we bring in additional resources from outside by essentially exporting goods and services. So, for example, in typical, as many of you are fully aware, typically local people in the cities and regions in which these studies are being conducted are almost an irrelevancy. Which seems odd. I make an observation on a later slide I'll make it now, is that, you know, if you're trying to influence government officials to sort of be more forthcoming with support, moral and, of course, financial, wouldn't you be a little bit more concerned about the voting public that's in your city? But essentially, all we care about is bringing tourists in, or other people. I mean, it's almost like, oh my God, it's unfortunate some local people are going to these things. And they don't count, because unless you can make a persuasive argument, which sometimes can be made, but it's usually a strained argument about import substitutions, namely that if these events weren't taking place in this particular city or region, people would be going elsewhere to spend the money, and so even if they're spending it locally and they're natives, that at least it's keeping some resources there that otherwise would have left. Well, one of the biggest problems in export-based theory from the beginning, Doug North had made this point many years ago, I had examples in the 1987 paper, is that obviously there's a limit to what exporting can ever do, because while an individual city could possibly export to the surrounding counties, and the county could export to the surrounding state or province, and the province could export to the country, and the country could export to the rest of the world. Who does the world export to? We aren't yet sending products to Mars, even though we do have equipment wandering around there. So ultimately, if economies only grow by exporting things, there has to be some intrinsic limitation to this notion, because exporting ultimately cannot be happening. And so you have to ultimately decide, and in fact the evidence for export theories is pretty tortured in terms of whether or not the degree of exportation of a region is really closely correlated to the differential growth rates in terms of how the economy is doing. So there's an issue about the export-based theory, and it also comes down to an issue that I wrote about back then, and I continue to write about since, and it's a view that I hold pretty strongly, which is frequently what goes on with events, organizations, and whatever, Olympics, I think is a good example of this, is what happens within regions is probably even more important than what's going on inter-region. I know I wrote about the Atlanta Olympics back in '96, and I think it's fair to say that in that instance, one of the most dramatic, if you know anything about Atlanta, one of the most dramatic things that happened was a tremendous change in the location of regional investment into the center city, into the inner city neighborhoods, which was not happening. The city of Atlanta was, like many American cities, a metropolitan area that was doing quite well overall. In fact, Atlanta was growing spectacularly, but the city itself, sort of the donut hole, with the donut surrounding it, the donut was getting larger, but the donut hole was staying very fragile. Suddenly, all this investment was shifting into the city, and it has had long-term implications because of the intra-regional, not the inter-regional issues. Yes, you had that potentially $6 billion, depending on the estimate, over about a 7-year period, flowing into the shore and then leaving again, but the more permanent thing were these intra-regional effects. Another issue I call the horror of in-plan and other canned economic impact models. I call it a horror because if you're trying to actually convince anybody that these things should be done correctly, they just love the fact that you can go and get these input-output models, which do cost something to acquire, depending how extensive the database is. It can cost something above a trivial amount. But these are essentially input-output models that sort of clarify the so-called multipliers, whether they're employment multipliers or income multipliers or output multipliers, whether they're direct or indirect multipliers, whatever they are. It gives the impression, a totally false impression, that all you have to do is just, throw on a amount of money into this model, and this magic numbers come out. And one of the key things that's been wrong about this methodology forever has been the stress on multipliers. I mean, if you multiply 0 times a multiplier, it's still going to be 0. And so the net injection that starts out as the direct base is where all the hard work takes place. An in-plan does nothing about this, nothing. I mean, answers no question about it. It only talks about essentially what happens after an initial injection of funds goes into a region and then recycles again. They don't talk about where the money came from, did it originate internal or external, how much of the spending was done by outside people, was actually captured by local people. One reason, for example, why the sports study generates such depressingly bad results, at least for a sports advocate, is that a lot of the, especially for sports teams, the teams have basically local fans. And unless it's a big import substitution argument that they would go somewhere else if the team wasn't there, they're spending local money there rather than somewhere else. But a lot of the money is going to players who do not even live local, or they're spending a lot of money, heaven knows where, probably in Barbados or something. And so the money is essentially leaving, so you almost have a net drain on the economy. So it's not too surprising that a lot of times the actual, when you look at the results of like strikes, sometimes you see some negative results. It was an interesting study in Canada where, and this will not surprise Canadians, or North Americans who like ice hockey, that when the 2004-2005 strike occurred with the National Hockey League losing the whole season, a tortured but still very soundly done econometric analysis was able to confirm that, in fact, hotel occupancy rates did fall throughout Canada. But interestingly enough, this was portrayed in the Journal of Sports Economics as an almost shocking result. It was a result that basically said, contrary to the usual consensus, that these things matter, or don't matter, excuse me, contrary to that they don't matter, we at least have found some evidence that they might have mattered in this case. It was almost like, we have to go back and look at this again. How can we get this result? Or another study finally did find some evidence that, at least for smaller college towns, as opposed to large cities which house college and university, it is true that, especially if they have vibrant, big-time sporting teams, that the amount of employment in the restaurant and hotel industry is larger, and that's both economically significant and statistically significant. But again, this result is portrayed as somewhat of an outlier. Oh wait, we actually found some possible evidence by focusing on a very specific sector which seems to be driving this. So the problem with implant and these other kind of models, and I'll address later, some issues also with this phenomenon, which is especially popular in the U.S. and North America in general, online economic impact calculators. These are sort of easy ways to handle certain things, and they can be abused. I will confess before I even get to that point that I have been almost forced to engage in the enterprise of trying to at least make these online calculators less abusive. It's another one of those, if you can't defeat this, you have to at least join them to stem the tide of complete idiocy. So I have actually developed a number of these online calculators, one for the events in the arts, which the state of Georgia uses extensively, and also one for organizations. But we'll get to that as quickly as I can here, because I know we don't have much time. Okay, the high cost of doing excellent economic impact studies, which is also, by the way, similar to the very high cost of doing competent contingent evaluation studies. I mean, these are not trivial studies to do. If you're going to really do them correctly, I mean, for example, economic impact, you've got to really trace all the sources of funds, sort of figure out the subcontractors, the contractors, where's the source of money, where's the use of the money. You have to figure out all the interdependencies that are going on. Essentially, it's not a trivial exercise. Also, the same thing with CBM, as they call it, contingent evaluation model. Because of the high cost of doing them, along with the availability of these seemingly, foolproof, but I'm suggesting not at all, models like implant, which are just basically multiplier generators, not direct impact generators, and so the whole enterprise becomes over simplified. It forces people who want genuinely to know what the likely impact of their organization is or their event is. It forces them to sort of look for these shortcuts. It's an inevitability. You're going to look for shortcuts. So the question is, how do we make these shortcuts at least quasi-defensible, which is how I got roped in to doing some of these online calculator analysis. And finally, I've already mentioned this, I call it the existential threat from ex post verification econometric analysis. Again, you have to remember, all of these economic impact studies And even for that matter, the CPM studies, I mean, it's hard to do an ex post CPM study to some extent. I mean, where you can do an ex post EIM study. I mean, ex post basically means, okay, the World Cup has now left Berlin and Germany. What did it matter? Or the London Olympics is now over. Let's look back and see if we can find whether or not holding constant, as econometrics would naturally do statistically, if you've got all the control variables, which is always a problem, is it really possible to isolate the unique effect of this event on various economic indicia? And this is where things get really interesting, because so often these studies have shown that you can't, which is sort of almost mysterious. Now, one of the questions Andre mentioned, asked me to address was, is it really, should we really say, okay, look, there's so many flaws in economic impact methods, let's just go to something else completely. This is evaluation. It's my view that basically these are measuring somewhat different things, although they can be overlapping. And so my own view, by the way, is ideally you do all of this, because it's sort of like business valuation. You often use multiple approaches. So why not use every tool you have available? But this is just sort of documenting some of the key errors or key problems that we know exist that well-done studies have to avoid. So an economic impact, of course, the one that I've already been mentioning, is the direct-based spending diversion problem, including capture rates. This basically is a matter of saying, once again, just because you've got spending coming in, even to some extent from outside people, how much of the spending is really being diverted from other uses? Local spending is especially likely to be true. It's diverted. But even if you have money coming in from the outside, even if you're tracking zip codes or something, and seeing where people are coming from that are attending these events, and even if you believe the second problem is not a big problem, the attribution problem, namely, were people there really for the event, or were they going to be there anyway, okay? Even then, you can't be sure it's a net direct base effect, because the money might leave immediately. This capture rate is an attempt to figure out how much of the money even goes through round one. If it never goes through round one, why worry about multipliers? If immediately, for example, some of the money spent on hotels, it's repatriated in profits to the ownership groups that are located elsewhere, this money is not circulating in the local economy, even through the first round of any kind of multiplier analysis. The ancillary spending attribution thing, this is an interesting one, because again, you might be really happy because when you've done an audience survey of people attending your event or organizational performances or whatever, and oh my God, it's really great. People are coming in from all over the country, all over the world. Well, ask yourself, did they really show up in your city to go to that event? Or were they there for something else, like a conference was going on? And they're bored to tears, so they find something to do, they go to your event. So instead of then saying, oh gee, 4 nights of hotel spending and restaurant spending and God knows what, it's really because of your event, which of course are a complete fallacy. And of course there are ways to try to get at this, I'll get to in a moment, because there are some really interesting efforts to do this and downsize this and make that correction. Okay, multiplier. One of the key things that's wrong with multipliers is they don't adjust for the size of the region. Small areas will have a much more likely phenomenon of money really coming in from the outside. There's more outside there. But the money leaves immediately because those are not self-contained economies. So you have a natural tendency for these to be offsetting. A large area will tend to have much more of the non-export. To whatever extent the export thing works at all, it's much less likely to be happening in larger cities. But then it's true, any net injections will at least recycle longer because it's a more self-contained economy. But there is a remarkable unwillingness or lack of recognition, at least in the naive studies, about how those multipliers absolutely must be adjusted. Crowding out supply constraints. This is one that the sports people adore. They love this. And I've got them on some fascinating debates with them about this because, again, as much as I've been a critic of these things, trust me, I mean, these sports guys are just crazy about this stuff. I mean, they are convinced hosting a Super Bowl has zero benefits to the local host community. Almost zero. Sometimes negative. Or their best case scenario is take any estimate done to the National Football League divided by 10. That's their favorite little adjustment. World Cup as well. Just divide it by 10, you might get close. Well, one of the things they say is crowding out. This one guy wrote this article about the Atlanta Super Bowl back in 2000 and said, look, as with all Super Bowls, the problem with this is, how can all these people be accommodated? Is there enough room in the hotel? How do they even get to the city? How can you suddenly have them all, zooming in here and doing all of this, unless you totally crowd out everything else that's going on? How can the local economy's infrastructure even cope with this? That to get these big numbers seems totally preposterous. So I thought to myself, well, I'd done some consulting for the airport. I've done consulting a lot of different people, and happen to know a lot of the data at the airport, and I also have big hotel contacts in Atlanta. And so I wrote this opinion piece, because I went to these data sources, and I tried to figure out exactly how it could have been true that over a 5-day period, including media coming in, people sometimes coming in for a longer time, exactly how the rather large and vibrant Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, which is the busiest airport in the United States, how you can actually, given the number of flights, the number of lands, the number of takeoffs, the actual occupancy rates of the planes typically, how you could have actually gotten these people in, contrary to this notion that they couldn't have possibly happened. But sure, you're sort of fighting crazy fights on that stuff. I mean, imagine writing opinion pieces, you're trying to figure out exactly how many people can get in a plane that wouldn't have been there otherwise, just to prove that, at least by definition, something could have happened, as opposed to their view of nothing could possibly happen. So you're sort of fighting this crazy fight. So, this is the basic argument that even on construction, the argument is, okay, this building's being constructed, it appears obvious that you're getting some jobs that wouldn't have otherwise existed, but you know what? It probably means that other building wasn't being constructed. Well, maybe, but maybe not. I mean, try that now in the current environment, with all this excess capacity, and construction industry in complete collapse. It seems totally unlikely that that would be the case. But nevertheless, you do want to look at supply constraints and travel. Ex post verification we discussed, which is a weakness. The arts, we haven't done much ex post verification, but pretty much something done in sports primarily. We do a little bit of it non-econometrically for the most part. We sometimes do check and see whether our best case scenarios, how many people are attending, or what have occupancy rates in hotels. You can sort of check that afterwards and sort of talk to the hotel people and say, well, did you notice anything going on there? And they'll say, well, not really. Same kind of thing that we had normally, didn't seem to matter. So then that kind of ex post verifies that maybe there was a problem with those ex ante projections. So we can do a little bit of that, and it has been done. By the way, I will tell you that this excess capacity problem is not completely irrelevant by any means. And I remember dealing with the sports community in Atlanta in trying to figure out whether they should bid to once again host the Super Bowl. And this particular year that they were aiming for, they went to the hotel people and they basically said, will you support us on this? We put some money into this and try to get this bid. And they said, well, actually no, because that particular year we're already booked so much in advance that it's unclear that we would really have any great benefit from that, at least over that period of time. Now I'll discuss in a second this whole thing about time shifting, which is a key issue here. And then finally, general versus partial equilibrium is basically the idea, it's a very important idea, that even if you find notable, significant, even dramatic, actual economic impacts of the employment, tax revenue, personal income, and output level, those dimensions, it's unclear that, of course, the best use of your money from a public sector point of view would have been to support that enterprise, because there could have been better results somewhere else. Now, while that's true, you can't take that too far. I mean, let's face it, we never have, at any one moment, the full array of options to be considered at any one time. So that's a little bit unfair to say, well, I mean, it's a legitimate point to make that a positive result is kind of a necessary, that a sufficient condition for supporting it with public funds. But, at the same token, if you're really sort of waiting around to say, well, we can't make a decision now because we need to figure out what the next 10 best options are to make sure that this one, sort of a cost-benefit analysis, this one has like an internal rate of return high enough to cut off, be in the top 5. We are almost never going to have that. Time's of the essence. It's hard to do that, actually. But I'm not going to go through the CBM errors. I don't have time. I just mentioned to you. There's a long list, okay? Basically, doing this contingent valuation thing, which is basically a matter of saying, for those who are not necessarily even using it or attending it or anything else, how much do you value? It's kind of like saying about a sports team or arts organizations. You're saying basically, well, I can't really find any dramatic, tangible effects here on the earnings side or the employment side. But you know what? If you ask people, would they give even $10 a year to prevent these organizations from collapsing or leaving the city or something? Well, Can you get them to say yes? And oftentimes you can, but of course it's obvious, thinking about that without even any technical expertise, that the way that those questions are couched, how that's set up, is fraught with potential error. I mean, it's sort of like asking somebody, how much do you value pristine water off the coast of Alaska? Well, obviously, if you don't put a budget constraint on it or put some context on this, it's easy to say, I'd pay easily $1,000. I mean, what's the problem? I mean, that's no budget constraint. So these are obviously also key problems, and we know those, and Jen actually did a very nice job also of documenting these in her book on different approaches to evaluating the arts. Okay, a couple technical issues. This is a useful thing to go through a little bit. On that question of, they call it sort of attribution, like exactly how much of the spending done even by non-local people should be counted as uniquely attributable to this event, organization, whatever. Some people have made a very serious effort to get it down and figure out whether the people were there for that purpose or whether they're just ancillary, they were just there and just trying to go to this event. So one of these studies was back in 2000, from the Journal of Cultural Economics, about the Barnes art exhibit in Ottawa Hall in Canada. And the long and short of it was, just to get the point, they originally started out with about a 67 million Canadian dollar possible direct impact. By the time they got done figuring out how much of this was not really attributable to these events, down to 8 million, a downward adjustment of 88.1%. Okay, which means you knocked out a lot. Okay, so all this sort of ancillary spending, a ton of it got knocked out. One of my favorite books, it was actually, this is by 1992 already. I mean, I know Peter Johnson a little bit, knew him, and he did a great job with Barry Thomas. He wrote this book, a small little book, on the open air museum in the UK. And basically, the whole book is complete with a lot of really fun little technical stuff. But they also made a serious effort to, again, figure out this attribution factor of exactly how many people who were spending this money, especially those who were seemingly outside the area, would not have otherwise spent it if it hadn't been for this museum. And they had basically an attribution factor of about 8.5%, meaning that you could knock out 91.5% of all this. I mean, so they were a little bit lower than the Canadians, which were knocked out 11.94%. So I will mention that there's a potential weakness of this, in whatever CBM weaknesses there are in talking to people and getting responses from them. I mean, these were also interview things. So actually, Johnson and Thomas had this, in many ways, very technical book about this. A nice job, a really nice job on really doing, I think, the best you can almost do with economic impact studies. But ultimately, on these questions, they instead of just relentlessly asking what was going on, sort of further probing visitors, dividing them into stayers, local day trippers, non-local day trippers, other day trippers, yielding, so it's sort of a spending diversion, okay? How much of the spending, if the museum didn't exist, even on the local side, how much of the spending would have actually been done elsewhere locally, okay? And after doing that, they made another adjustment. They got spending diversion of an average of 76%. So between 71.1 and 80.9%. So, and by the way, the question they were asking basically was this: what would you have done with your money if Beanish had not existed? And they kind of try to figure out, what would happen here. Now again, all the weaknesses of asking people what they would do, I mean, there's an element of guesswork, I suppose, there. So, you have to be a little cautious about that. But so as with CBM, there's always some weakness in the info obtained in that way. But the point I'm making is, on those particular issues, which have been well known regarding weaknesses of the EIM approach, there have been some very serious efforts made to correct for those, and the amount of correction is fairly dramatic. Okay. One important change that I've noticed over time, and this is a good change, is people that ask you to do economic impact studies are increasingly sensitive about the possibility for disaster, and turning good press into horrible press. One of the most famous examples in the U.S. was the reopening of the Museum for Modern Art in Manhattan, which had been closed for a couple of years, then reopened, I think maybe 3 years for renovation, then reopened, in New York, where there's, of course, so many things to do, it's fairly unimaginable that most people would not have visited there, just because MoMA was temporarily closed. Nevertheless, a study done for MoMA in 2006 generated this preposterous result. 2 billion spending impact, 650 million personal wage income, 50 million, maybe $50 more accurate, actually. 50, there's sort of a Freudian slip of the best kind. 50 million in local tax revenues, and over 4,000 new jobs. Well, this generated this opinion piece in the New York, I think the Wall Street Journal, actually, by some economists who were actually very sympathetic to the Yorks. I mean, they were big fans. But they said, look, this was just creative accounting of the worst type. And MoMA had sort of like, was sort of really very nervous about this bad visit we were getting, and this is sort of a well-known example in the U.S. So again, creativity is good, creative accounting, not generally all that good. Now, on my technical challenges, a couple things real quickly here. Okay, so the clients have caught on to this. They say, okay, look, we understand this. We've got this aquarium going. Seems like a big thing. We do zip code analysis. A lot of people are there from other zip codes right across the country, even some international people. What do you do with those people? So you say, well, it's probably not that credible that they actually came to your city just because of that. They're probably there anyway for something. They decided to go there. So we won't use that argument. But what we will do is this. We think that the ongoing increase in the array of cultural amenities, which is broadly defined to include sports amenities, just the value of the quality of life there, people will probably spend an extra half a day there. They would have otherwise left. And they might bring a spouse, they might bring their kids, otherwise they wouldn't have gone to the conference with these people, significant others of various kinds. The problem with this is, everybody loves this argument. And I'm now speculating, since everybody has used the argument, that anybody visiting Atlanta, for example, is not expected to stay at least a month. Because every single organization is counting them as staying an extra half a day. So you've got this double counting of staying. People just never leave. They're just sort of moving permanently to your town. So this is the category of a legitimate adjustment overdone. Okay. Again, tracking contractors and subcontractors for accurate capture rates is necessary, not always manageable. Again, this is important. The immediate leakages are adjustments prior to any multiplier leakages. So that's a key challenge. And you may or not get cooperation from people who are asking you to do this study. Where's the money going? Who are you actually paying? Even on the construction side. If you're basically bringing a gigantic piece of sculpture for your new performing arts center, and it was produced in Italy, and you're doing a study in Belgium or something, well, that's not typically up in the Belgian economy. Okay, I always love this one too. I mean, in almost any city this will happen. It's happening in Atlanta all the time. The airport people say, look, this airport makes getting to Atlanta really easy, very convenient. So anything going on there, forget about it. The World Congress Center, which is one of the main places for major conferences that take place, says, wait a minute, if it was for us, nobody would actually leave the airport, go to the city, they would just be transiting, because there's a big So everybody's sort of like trying to figure out who's responsible for this. And this if you have two different people doing the two different studies separately, you can be sure you're going to double count. Even if you're doing it yourself, it might be tricky. Like, I had to do one time where the New World of Coca-Cola was relocating in Atlanta, and the Georgia Aquarium was open, which is really the world's largest aquarium. And though they shared similar clientele, and they were interested in both the combined effect, and they were neurotic enough that they wanted to know their separate effects. And that was really very tricky. Okay, well, I'll have to not get through all my slides. So many slides. So luckily, fear not. I'm not going to go through all of them. Time switching. This is an interesting one. Time switching has been used by critics of economic impact studies, by and large, and the sports people love to use this argument. They basically said the following. Well, okay, fine. Yes, it's true. A lot of these people did go to the World Cup. They did go to to Mariboru because it was a cultural capital of Europe during that period of time. But you know what? And of course, in some cases, we were critical of others. They'll say, look, some of these people already were planning to go there. They were planning to go there. But because this event was occurring, and they knew it was occurring, they simply shifted their time to coincide with when this event was occurring. So it's not like if the event didn't happen, there wouldn't have been this injection of activity to the region. It's just just a matter of time shift. But what I have always hated about that argument is it's so one-sided. I think they're fine to mention that. But I don't understand why they don't pick up on the other part of this, the counterbalancing part, which is that, for the most part, these mega events, festivals, arts festivals, and sporting events, I mean, they're well-known way in advance. I mean, what moron doesn't realize, oh, well, the World Cup's going to be hosted in Rio de Janeiro at a certain time. I think I'll avoid my trip to Rio if I really don't want to get involved in the very high hotel rates. I'll just shift that time. I can easily do it. Why not? I mean, I know it's happening, and when it's happening, I'll just shift to a little bit later in the month or the year. I mean, what's the problem? So this notion that somehow or other, this massive crowding out is happening because people can't time shift, I think is just preposterous. And one of the problems with the econometric studies is, when they find no tracks in the sand, I'm not quite sure they have the right time period. If you look for tracks in the sand for the exact period of time the event's happening, they may not see it, because any of this crowding out that might be causing this is being shifted. And because I want to go get to that slide separately, I'll just mention to you also, in those econometric studies, there's no question, perhaps the biggest problem, and the sports economists know it, they understand it, they admit it, I give them credit for that, they absolutely admit it, is, you know, even these impacts, when they're fairly large in absolute dollars, they really are not that big when you compare it to the overall size of the economy. No matter what that economy is, local, regional, state, national. I mean, these are impacts that would be considerably, they'd be some fraction of 1% of GDP or something, okay? So even though I mean, if you talk about like a World Cup or a Super Bowl or an arts festival or a cultural capital, series of events having $300 million or euros of impact, it looks big, but then divide that by the entire GDP or something, and you get a small amount. So it's not that it's not an important impact, it's not that it shouldn't guide public sector decision making in some sense if it's legitimate, but are you really going to be able to find it in ex post econometric studies? It's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. So I think in many respects you're not getting statistical significance on this because it's just very hard to do, quite frankly. Okay. Now, when should I be wrapping this up? Like 3 or 4 minutes. Okay. Very good. Okay. I'll try to just hit a few of the key points coming. Well, one thing on sales tax calculation. This is sort of a mechanical issue. This one people do not do. They should make this clear. You should almost have 2 different calculations of your sort of direct base. You should have one that basically is linked to the tax base, and then one's linked to sort of the output base. It goes like this. A frequent occurrence is somebody hosts an event. The ticket revenues are actually going to be captured by a non-local sponsor. This is very big on sports, okay? A lot of times sporting events take place, and it might be sponsored by a league or a sporting association, and the revenues directly from the tickets might leave the community, never sort of lands in the community, okay? Now, this can happen in the arts context as well, maybe not quite as often, but even if that happens, the taxation still will be done and captured by the local city or state or regional, whoever do the taxation. They'll still be captured by that local jurisdiction. So you don't want to leave that out. Just because you made a direct adjustment that to some extent the capture rate is low on the output side, and it will leave the economy so quickly it won't ever register and won't go through the multiplier process. You don't want to lose out on capturing those tax revenues, which then, because they then do get injected locally, can have a multiplier effect. So that's a key thing. Okay, I've already mentioned a little bit about export-based models and some of their weaknesses and why intra-regional versus inter-regional is more important, so I'll skip that slide. I'll just mention that one thing that's definitely happening on the export-based side is a lot of good research going on right now that basically says, okay, fine. Because the export-based concept, the notion that you can only grow if you have a big export sector, and therefore the arts can only be a really important driver force for economic growth if it's an export industry, that has definitely been a problem because it's hard to say that it really is a big export industry. But people like Ann Markison, who I know very well and I've done work with, and I'm on panels with her constantly, I'll be on one in about a month and a half to get up in Canada. She's been basically arguing the following, which is that the impact of artists and the arts community in general is being seriously underestimated because of a number of key factors. One argument she makes is artists have bigger impacts than measured by EIM studies because they produce produce goods and services that are indeed legitimate import substitutes. The argument sort of is, well, if you have a thriving local arts community, she believes it's really true, and this is a tricky thing to show empirically, this is the problem. Her empirical results are not yet totally persuasive. But she believes that it's not just fictitious to say that that will in fact keep more people, keeping the money local rather than diverting it outside. I mean, we know there are a couple well-known examples of import substitution. A very famous paper in the Journal of Cultural Economics some years ago talking about the Grateful Dead, who in fact had, as we all know, one of the most devoted fan bases known to humankind. And deadheads would literally travel the world, at least within a continent, to follow the Grateful Dead, who are now both non-grateful and dead. So, in some sense, they're gone. But the fans would always follow it. So if the Grateful Dead showed up in your town that year, that would cut out at least some trips of your local people leaving the community. So that would be a legitimate adjustment. So Anne says, okay, on the one hand, in a more general way, a vibrant arts community will keep more money local. Secondly, it's her view that artists have an unusually high marginal propensity to consume locally, and therefore it should be consumed by the consumer. In that sense, the multiplier should be higher. Now this is again, these arguments, by the way, those first and second arguments are not really inconsistent with export-based thinking. They're just really adjusting it to the case that artists probably are much more capable within the usual confines of these EIM studies of being productive than we might think. She also points out what most of us have always also wanted to do. This has always been the big challenge. I was on a panel recently, the National Endowment for the Arts in the U.S., and huge numbers of proposals for funding were of the type of number 3. To what extent is arts education, or artists in general, or arts activities, truly increasing productivity? Truly, these are the old battles about whether or not kids exposed to the arts get intelligent faster. Some of them have been disappointing, because we know the old Mozart effect ended up being a myth. The notion that you play Mozart in the background while studying, you'll do better. It turned out through more careful study, it wasn't happening. It could have been the Grateful Dead, okay? Or it could have been something else. It could have been probably just like street noise or something. You know, and so, but the notion that this could happen, we were always trying to capture this, and if we could measure it, we'd do it. And I'll just tell you the good news is, there really are quite a few interesting studies being done, trying to nail this down, to try to find these more intrinsic benefits of arts activity. Well, I'm about out of time here, see if there's anything else I can say, and I've already done that, regional stuff. Well, I mean, that's sort of a comment about whether the Anne-Marguson results are actually, this might be a final observation. I won't be able to tell you about all my fun work on online calculators, but they'll probably be better served by me not doing that. I tried to make an argument some years ago in a paper I wrote, and again, the empirical results still are pretty ambiguous, but it's sort of a syllogism, okay? We all sort of find this syllogism attractive. It's kind of like a Richard Florida argument. But again, that's with Richard Florida, the evidence is always kind of mixed. A healthy urban core is essential to balanced growth and long-term mortality in that region. Artists and artistic institutions typically play vital roles in rejuvenating and strengthening core urban neighborhoods. Therefore, the arts are vital to long-term economic development in our region. Well, that sounds great. That's a nice sort of syllogism that ties that in. The problem is, alas, that there are enough examples of even the area around Atlanta, and I do so many studies up there, not limited to there. But the region of the southeast, or Georgia, was growing dramatically. and the city of Atlanta itself, and the urban core, was lagging. And you have plenty of examples of this, where, and I would love to be able to show empirically, that balanced growth, urban cores are really vital. And I think they're more vital maybe in some parts of the world than others, but I think this is a key question, because we always want to know. There's a lot of work going on about cultural clustering. There's been some discussion already here about that in this conference. And cultural clusters are a very big deal, and geographical locations are a very big deal. The question is, in addition to sort of just finding out where artists accumulate, what possible externalities among themselves artistically are there, does it really matter that this kind of development is happening in certain parts of cities? Because the old story is, we think it's right, that an urban area is only as strong as its weakest link. If that's really true, then of course it's really vital that arts is really rejuvenating there. But I'm not quite sure we can prove that empirically. I don't think it's really worked exactly. The evidence is quite ambiguous. Okay, I'm out of time. You're out of patience.